Now that you have seen how we can show video content, it's time to take a look at some more rich visual representations of content. Previously, it wasn't possible using plain HTML to show rich content inside of the browser. Simply drawing anything with HTML was impossible. There was no support for that. If we wanted to create rich graphics, we had to resort again to using a plugin such as Silverlight or Flash, with the same possible issues as we discussed before when looking at media content. Both Flash and Silverlight were added to an HTML page using the object tag. Now with HTML5, the platform gets native support for two types of rich content rendering, the canvas and SVG, and in this module we'll use the canvas. In module 7 we'll look at SVG. Now what is that canvas all about? As the name implies, the canvas in HTML5 is like a real-world canvas. It's a drawing pane on which we can paint pixels in different colors, hence building up a rich graphical representation natively in the browser. The canvas in HTML5 can do more than a real-world canvas, as it not only supports static content, but can also be used for moving content such as games. The canvas is pixel-based. We draw pixels on it. That means that it is not scalable. The content is getting a fixed size. We'll see in the next module that SVG, on the other hand, is scalable by default because it is based on vector graphics. The canvas in itself is a really simple element when it comes to declaring it in HTML5. We'll see that in a second. By default, the canvas has no visual representation. It is just a lookless pane. So how do we then get that rich content on there? Well, all the drawing is done using a quite extended JavaScript API again. Very often, the browser allows the GPU, so the graphical processing unit of the PC, to render the canvas, and that is for performance reasons. Let's see how we can work with the canvas. As mentioned, in terms of HTML, the canvas is really simple. You simply place a canvas element on the page as shown here in the sample code. We can then specify a size, and if we omit the size, it will default to 300 by 150 pixels. Now that's about it for the HTML. All the rest is done using the JavaScript API. Now in the JavaScript part, there are a couple of steps we need to follow to start working with the canvas. You'll always have to follow these as the first steps when interacting with your canvas. As the first step, we need to get hold of the canvas in code, and to do so we can use the document.getElementById, passing in the ID of the canvas. We won't use the canvas directly in code to actually draw on it. Instead, we'll use an intermediate called the context. And we can get hold of the context using the getContext method, passing in the type, which is in this case here 2D. With the context in hand, we'll soon be able to draw on the canvas. Now one thing you shouldn't forget is, just like with the video element, adding fallback content for browsers who do not support the canvas element. Now let's draw on our canvas. As mentioned, the canvas is a drawing pane and it has a coordinate system. The point with coordinates 0, 0 is at the top left, so all the drawing starts from that point. In the sample code you see here on the slide, we are going to draw a filled rectangle. On the context, we first set the fill style to a solid color. Next, with this style active, we draw a rectangle using the fillRect method, passing in the coordinates 0, 0, the width of 100 and the height of 8 pixels. Another method is the strokeRect method, which draws a rectangle with just a stroke and no fill. The clearRect method clears a rectangular part of the canvas. Now, while the clearRect method can be used to clear contents, in some occasions we may want to clear the entire canvas. There's a little shortcut to do that, and that is setting the width of the canvas equal to, well, the width of the canvas, as you can see here on the slide. Of course, the world exists out of more than just rectangles, so we need to be able to get other things drawn on the canvas as well. More complex shapes than rectangles are created using a path. A path can be seen as a combination of several subparts, and a subpart, on the other hand, can be considered a number of points which form a line. And to a part, we can not only add subparts, but also figures. Let's take a look at some code to draw on the canvas. In the sample code you see here, we get hold of the context and then call the move_to method, passing in x and y coordinates. What this does, it moves the starting point for the drawing to that particular point in the canvas. Next we call the line_to method, which will create a line from the starting point 100, 0 to the end point 200, 100. Finally, calling the stroke method on the context will actually draw the line. Let's take a look at a more complex path. In the sample you see here, we see that we are indeed creating a path, which consists out of several subparts. We first set the starting point for the drawing, the move_to 10, 10, and next we call the line_to method several times. This will create the several subparts. After that, we also set the fill style and call both the fill and stroke method, and this will draw us a red rectangle. To draw a circle, we have the arc method available. And the arc method has quite a few properties to control how the arc is being drawn, but they are outside of the scope of this course. Now in the sample code here, we see that we are creating effectively an arc. This method accepts the starting coordinates, so 100, 100, the radius, the start angle and the end angle, which are both in radians. Now the arc method in the previous example was just a border. We can of course apply styling on the elements we are drawing on the canvas. On the canvas, there's support for applying solid colors as well as gradients on elements for both the fill and the stroke. To apply such a style, we use the fill style method for the fill color and the stroke style method for the stroke color. And as with other things in HTML, we can use the color name, the hex value, the RGB value, or the ARGB value. In the sample code you see here on the slide, we are first creating an arc again. Then we set the fill style and the stroke style, and only after that we can call the fill and stroke methods on the context. This will then draw the arc with the style specified in the stroke style and fill style methods. Next we change the fill style and call the fill rect method, which will take the currently applicable color for filling the rectangle. So as you can see, the canvas will always draw the new items with the current set of styles. As mentioned in the previous slide, it's not only possible to apply solid colors on elements, we can also apply gradients while drawing on the canvas. In the sample code you see here, we are first creating a gradient using the create linear gradient method. This doesn't do anything yet, we're just creating the gradient and we are specifying its position and size. Indeed, this may seem a bit weird. We are creating the gradient for a particular area in the canvas and will later use that gradient as a fill for an element we add to the canvas. Next, we are creating the color stops for the gradient using the addColorStop method. This accepts relative values, and for each of these, we specify what the color should be in that position. We're adding 3 color stops here: red, blue, and green. Finally, we specify the created gradient to be the currently applicable style using the fill style method again. And when we then use the fill rect method, we will draw with the just created gradient. Now, notice that you don't see any of the green part in the gradient. That is because, like I said, the gradient is created for a particular area and our rectangle is smaller than the gradient's area. The canvas isn't limited to working with items we create on the fly, such as rectangles or arcs. We can also load images into the canvas to create more advanced graphics with the canvas. Drawing an image is done using the draw image method on the canvas, which accepts the image we want on the canvas and the position in this first overload of the method we see here on the slide. Now, how do we get an image on the canvas, you may ask? Well, again, the answer lies in JavaScript. Take a look at the next sample code here. The image we want to load in is part of the HTML DOM, so we can retrieve it using the getElementById again. Once we have the image, we can pass it to the drawImage method to draw it on the canvas. The image on the canvas, just like everything else on the canvas, is just a collection of pixels. We can start deleting parts of the image, for example, using the clearRect method again. The drawImage method is also overloaded. In the next code snippet, we are using the drawImage with 5 parameters. These 2 extra parameters allow us to specify the size of the image in pixels on the canvas. Now, next to resizing, the drawImage also allows us to basically zoom in on a part of the image and draw the selected part, well, a bit bigger. To do so, we can use the overload you see here on the snippet, which accepts a total of 9 parameters. The parameters starting with an S are the values where to clip the original image. The regular ones specify where to draw the image on the canvas. Quite logically, there will be occasions in which we'll want to add text to our canvas. There are 2 simple methods available to do so. The fill text method, which creates solid text, and the stroke text method, which creates just the outlines for the characters. In the first sample code on the slide, you can see that we are first setting the font for the creation of the text. Next, we call the fill text method, and we get solid characters. In the second sample, we're doing exactly the same, but now we're using the stroke text method. Notice in the screenshot that the characters are now just an outline. 2 small things before we'll apply our canvas knowledge in the demo. The first one is transformations in the canvas. We've already seen other transformations in HTML5. In the canvas, transformations are basically changing the grid of the canvas. For example, we can apply a rotate transform, and what this will do is changing the angle of the grid on which we draw. And if we do a translation, we're moving the 0, 0 point, and all this results in very cool things we can do with the canvas. Let's take a look at this in some code. The rotate transform, like I just said, basically rotates the grid on which we draw. And the translate moves the starting point. Here we are first asking the context to translate, so move the origin to the center of the canvas using the translate method. Next, we are rotating over 45 degrees. Then we simply draw like we've done before, but now we are drawing in a changed grid of pixels. And the result is that the rectangle is rotated and drawn in the center of the canvas. We can also scale the grid system. Notice in the sample here, we are using the scale method to scale the context. We are scaling to half the size in vertical position. When we then draw a square, we end up with a rectangle, since the pixels in vertical size are scaled to half their original size. The final thing I want to show you for the canvas is the state mechanism we have available. It's possible to store on a stack the current settings of the canvas so that we can reuse them later on. And to do this, we have the save and restore methods available. Take a look at the sample here. Initially, we set the fill style to yellow and draw a rectangle. We then call the save method so the current state or settings of the canvas are stored. We then use red, save the red setting, and then use blue. After that, we'd like to continue with the settings we had before the blue one. So we call the restore method. This pops the blue settings off the stack and we can continue using the previous one. Let us now go back to our demo. We'll use the canvas there to draw a graph to show the statistics of sales of a particular coffee. In this demo, we are going to add the canvas, and we are going to actually use the canvas to show a graph of the sales for a particular coffee. So we are again going to make changes to the coffee details page where we are going to add this graph. Now, of course, we need to start by adding the canvas. So here is my canvas. I've given it a width and a height, and I've also specified some fallback content. basically saying to the user, well, sorry, but your browser does not support the canvas. You need to upgrade. You cannot see this sales graph. Now for the rest, there's very little I can do with the canvas itself. I need to work again with JavaScript. So I'm going to start by adding a new JavaScript file. So in my scripts folder again, I'm going to add a new JavaScript file called canvas chart. There we go. Now in this demo, I'm going to work with some hard-coded sales figures. In a real-life application, this should of course be downloaded, for example, using Ajax. So in here, I have my coffee sales for a period of 12 months, specifying how many times each coffee has been sold. Now the graph I'm going to create is a bar chart. Typically such a graph consists out of a couple of axes as well as a couple of bars. I'm going to start by creating a function that can create my axis. Now this create axis function accepts the context, which will be passed in to actually do the drawing, the start in the x and the start in the y coordinates, and the end x and the end y coordinates. So what I'm going to do is basically draw a line here. On the context, I'm going to call the begin path, saying that we're going to start the drawing. I'm then going to move to the start in the x and start in the y. That's the starting point for this path. I'm then going to say that I want to create a line to the end x and the end y point. Call the close path, and finally I'm going to call the stroke on the context. This is going to make a stroke from the start to the end point. The line is going to be drawn. Next, I'm going to create the create bar function, which now accepts an x and y for the starting position of the bar, so a rectangle, and a width and a height for the rectangle. So this is very similar, and now I'm going to use the rect function, passing in that starting point, the width and the height. I'm now also going to call the context.stroke as well as the context.fill, which is going to use the current fill to fill my rectangle. So we're now ready with the helper functions. I'm now going to add my draw chart function. So the draw chart function is the function that I'll be calling for my page. That's the first one. So the first thing I'm going to do is get hold of the canvas by using again a document get element by ID, passing in the bar chart ID. If the canvas is not null and the get context actually works, returns something basically, I'm going to get hold of my context by calling canvas.getContext2D. Then I'm going to call the create bar chart function, passing in my context and my data and some other setup data that we'll see in just a second. In the create bar chart method, I receive the context, the data, the starting point in the X for the drawing, the bar width, and the height for the entire chart. I specify the line width to be 1.2 pixels. And I also specify the start in the Y. Now this line width is going to be used to do the drawing of the axis. So I'm going to call my create axis function twice, passing in the context and some parameters where the actual drawing needs to be done. Now this context line width is going to be used because in my create axis, I'm just calling the stroke, and this is the current stroke line width. Next, I set the context line width to 0. Next, for each item in the array of data, I'm going to call to draw a bar chart. I'm not going to take you through all of this. The most important thing here is that I'm setting the fill style to blue. I'm calling my create bar function, passing in parameters where to draw the actual rectangle. And finally, I use my context to also put some text below the horizontal axis. And what I'm going to put there is the name of the month. In the coffee details page, I need to call my script. And also at the bottom of the page again, I need to call now my draw chart function. Let's take a look at this in the browser. And here at the bottom of the page, we now see our bar chart being drawn. We see the axis, the vertical one and the horizontal one. We see the text labels at the bottom of the page, and for each month we see a bar chart representing the number of sales for that particular month. All of this is done using the canvas, so all of this is pixel based. It doesn't really scale. Let's go back to the slides. This brings us to the end of Module 6. We have one more module to go, but before we start that, let's summarize what we have seen in this module. We started the module by looking at the new support for audio and video in HTML5. Using this support, we can play back media content without having to resort to plugins. We also have looked at the support of different browsers for different content types, which sadly is not a great story. Next, we have spent a lot of time exploring the Canvas API. With this mostly JavaScript-based functionality, it becomes possible to support rich graphics in the browser. As said, we have one more module to go, which will focus on SVG. I hope you are joining me there as well.